Thank you everyone for being here. Welcome to the Newburyport Literary Festival. My name is Leslie Hendrickson. I'm on the steering committee of the festival. And even though I can't see you, I am so glad you're here. We're excited about the festival this year. This is our second year online and our 16th edition. We hope to be back in person next year, but this format does allow us to bring new and different authors to the festival. And in fact, it's our biggest year effort with over 100 participants. Just a few things before we get started. We are using the webinar format. You probably know this by now, but you'll see and hear the panelists. You won't be able to see yourself. This session is being recorded and you'll be able to access it on the Newburyport Literary Festival website coming next week. If you have comments, please use the chat box. I can see people are already doing that. Let us know where you're from, if you're new to the festival or you're an old friend. There will be time for questions at the end. You can use the Q&A tab below to do that instead of the chat. Please use the Q&A instead of the chat. That allows the presenters to see the questions and keep them organized. As you may know, in the States, today is Independent Bookstore Day, and we want to support our independent bookstore partners. Links to our partner bookstores, the Bookshop of Beverly Farms and Jabberwocky Bookshop in Newburyport, are in the chat, or they will be when I put them there. And they have books from all the authors in the festival. We encourage you to support them or your own local bookshop. I'm also going to put the link to the Newburyport Literary Festival in the chat. We have tons more great events. We hope you join us for the rest of the weekend. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Carol Fitzgerald, who's going to introduce our panelists. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Leslie. It's so nice to be here. And everyone, welcome to the Newburyport Book Festival and the Listen Up panel. Yes, you're going to listen up for the next hour. I'm Carol Fitzgerald from bookreporter.com and the host of the Book Reporter Talks To video podcast series. And I am so looking forward to talking to our panelists, all of whom are audiobook narrators. I'm going to give you brief bios for each of them. Brief, I'm promising. So please go to the website to read much more about these people's amazing credentials. Also, we're going to go to Q&A about 40 minutes after the hour. I say 40 minutes after because I don't know what time zone you're in. So just know 40 minutes after, I'm going to go to your questions. If you don't have any, I just keep asking. So just know, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Start with Imogen Church, who has worked everywhere from theater to film, commercials to cabaret. But her favorite work is in audio, particularly audiobooks. And she was nominated for an Audie for the Best Female Narrator at the Audio Awards for her narration of One by One by Ruth Ware, which I listened to. January LaVoy is an Atlanta-based theater, television, and voice actress. In 2013, she was named Audiobook Narrator of the Year by Publishers Weekly. In the spring of 2019, she was honored with AudioPhile's Lifetime Achievement Award, the Golden Voice. She shares a 2021 Grammy nomination, hold on for this one, folks, with Meryl Streep and the cast of Charlotte's Web audiobook, in which she played the title role of Charlotte. Robert Petkoff has appeared on film and TV, as well as starring on Broadway. And really, you've got to go to his bio to see all the shows he's been on. I'm like, I recognize that guy. He has narrated over 250 audiobooks and is multiple Audie and AudioPhile Earphones Award winner and twice nominated as Male Narrator of the Year. Some of his more prominent audiobooks include Bob Woodward's Fear and Rage, multiple Michael Cordieff thrillers, and 30 Star Trek audiobooks. So welcome to all of you. Thanks so much for being here today. Oh, wait, I can't know if I can do that. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. I want to know right back at the beginning, how do you get hired to narrate an audiobook? Like, who makes that call? Is it the publisher, the audio publisher? January, let me start with you and just tell us like a little bit about that process of what happens.
Yeah, so it varies. Authors can have more or less involvement. At a certain level, the author is kind of the person who gets the say. And once you're sort of in the industry, you develop relationships with producers and publishers, and they know you and they know what you do and they know what you've done from them in the past. And so, it just sort of coalesces around the individual projects, but every publisher sort of has their own way of doing it. In terms of how you get into it, that's a bigger conversation that's kind of different for every audiobook narrator. I got into audiobook narration through theater, but I'd be really interested to hear how my fellow panelists got into it themselves.
Robert, how about that one? How did you get into doing this?
You know, I was doing straight up voiceover, commercial voiceover stuff, and my agent at the time had said, "Hey, do you want to narrate audiobooks? Hachette is looking for new audiobook narrators." And I thought, I like reading, why not? And so I did a couple of auditions for them that turned into bookings and work, and it just sort of snowballed from there. I was very lucky that the very first book I did for them, I was nominated for Male Narrator of the Year for a really fun book called Beat the Reaper, which was a first-person narrative. So it wasn't that far from acting for me. And I sort of learned as I went along, you know, there is a very big difference between acting and narrating. You know, you're storytelling as a narrator. I mean, we're all storytelling whether acting or not, but as a narrator, you need to have the narrator's voice, you need to have the character's voice. You don't, for me, I don't want to go too heavy with a character voice. I want to always, with dialects and things like that, do a very light feel to it, and to lead the listener on that journey. But that was me. I sort of fell backwards into it, and very fortunately got picked up by a bunch of different publishers. And as January said, you work with producers who know you, and they say, "Hey, I have a project I think you're right for." And then the big question is, does the author want your voice? You know, and fortunately, oftentimes they do, sometimes they don't.
Oh, wow. Imogen, how about you? Just tell us how you got started, and then I'm going to go to everybody for different questions.
I started narrating audiobooks for the blind. So there's an organization in Britain called the Royal National Institute for the Blind that was set up after World War I to do talking books for injured soldiers, and they are still going strong. And I'm a massive bookworm and an actor, so I thought, well, I really want to do this. So I went in and auditioned, and they kind of said, you know, there's a lot of like middle-class white girls. Yeah, I don't know what I can give you. And then I happened to mention that I used to do burlesque, and they went, "Paching, how would you feel about narrating erotica?" And I said, I have zero problem with that. And boom, I was off. I was narrating all of the erotic novels they had. And from there, they just went, "Oh, you're actually really good at this," and started recommending me to the big commercial publishers. And once I was in there, it just snowballed and went crazy. So yeah, that was how I got into it.
And you know, it is interesting because when I interview authors for our podcast, I always say, "Did you pick the narrator?" And they're always saying, "Oh yes, I got 3 or 4. And then I was listening and I was trying to figure out like who would be best for the book. And I listened to other things they've done." And then we're going to go into later how some people become the voice of those authors. We'll get into that a little bit later on. Robert, you mentioned producers. You mentioned the producer and the producer role. What does a producer do in the studio? I mean, I know you're seeing people recording albums, and you know what the producer does, but what happens with an audiobook producer?
Well, it depends if you have a producer / director. You know, oftentimes the producer may just be the person in charge of hiring the talent and hiring a director, and then making executive decisions later. Sometimes the producer is a producer / director. I just worked with Karen Perlman on a Star Trek book, and Karen is a great
I just worked with Karen Perlman on a Star Trek book.
We did the same book.
I just worked with Carol Fitzgerald on the Star Trek book.
But it's funny, January, Karen was talking about that. She goes, you know, when Karen gets the Star Trek books from Simon & Schuster, she reads them and she decides, should this be a male narrator or a female? What's the bigger point of view? I had done a couple of Star Trek Discovery books, but since Michael Burnham is really the main lead character on that, it's a female character, that she's like, it's a book for January, or this is a book for Robert. I do a lot of the original series, or Star Trek The Next Generation, or Star Trek Picard. But in that case, Karen says, yes, I think Robert should be doing this one. And then Karen and I get on. This one we actually did in my home studio, which is actually my converted bathroom, which became a necessity during lockdown. I had never recorded at home before, and I was forced during the lockdown to create something. But in that studio, then Karen's on Skype with me and giving me direction as we read through the book, and marking up the script for me and all of that. But yeah, the producer's role, you know, it depends. You know, it can vary from a very hands-off, I'm hiring a bunch of people to do it, or I am prepping the whole book. I'm going through and looking up the pronunciations of things. I'm contacting the author. How do you want this said? How do you want that said? To directing the actor, hey, slow down a little bit there. I think it should be a little more emotional here, that kind of a thing. So.
Mm-hmm. So they're actually pulling out how you're going to sound, like emote more here, or that's not the correct pronunciation of the word. This is like,
Yes.
how many times, go ahead.
I was going to say, the one thing I've found in audiobook narration, it is the most humbling thing you could imagine. There are a million words you think you know how they are pronounced. Pardon me. And you start narrating and you're like, wait, what? That's not the way you pronounce that. I've spent over 30 years saying that word wrong, and so that's the thing that I love about audiobooks. I get paid to read, which I love doing, and I get paid to be educated.
Well, it's funny you say that. My children both learned to read by sight. They never sounded out words. And my little one was always going, it's the epitome. And I was like, the epitome. And I said, epitome. But many times I'm listening to audiobooks and say, oh, how are they saying that word like that? I've never said the word like that. And I said, maybe that's the right way to say it. Maybe they were paid to say it correctly. And you've been saying it wrong all these years. Mm. So Imogen, what kind of upfront, you read the book, I take it in advance, you read the book so that you have some understanding of what the material is going to be. Do you mark up notes on it then? Do you mark up on paper? Do you mark up on an iPad? What do you do so that you have notes for when you're sitting down to record?
Yeah, I'm tablet all the way. I haven't done paper since I very first began about 10 years ago. So I am definitely tablet. And I just use a marking up program, which would be like iAnnotate or just the kind of Adobe Reader. And I'm highlighting the characters to make sure I can kind of differentiate between them, especially if you're conversing with yourself. Say there are 10 people in a room. You have to be all of those people talking to yourself. So for speed and to give you fluidity, I find it really helps to mark up each character like you would with a theatre script. And also just notes in the margin that how to pronounce things correctly, or notes for what might be coming over the page so you don't forget to lay the groundwork for something. But yeah, the number one rule is you must always read the book. Always read the book. You can't do it. I mean, imagine doing a thriller and there are apocryphal tales of big actors who've narrated thrillers, got to the end and found out that one of the characters was from Wales and have to redo the entire book. So yeah, whatever you do, read the whole book.
Read the whole book in advance. January, how about you? What are some tips that you do going in? Do you do tablet, paper? What are you doing?
Yes, definitely tablet. I remember the very first audiobook I did, which was about 12 years ago now, was a 500-page erotic vampire novel. And it had to be messengered to my apartment in New York. And it was just, this reams of paper. So the minute we were able to switch to tablet, I was all about it. I actually don't mark my scripts very much at all. When I go through, I mark them for research, a word I don't know how to pronounce, or as Imogen said, something that is unexpected, or like I think of it as scoring almost, but I find I get very distracted in my head if I mark my script too much. So I always liken my sort of technique as to getting in an automatic vehicle, putting it in drive, and then just using the accelerator and the brake is sort of how I go through it. But I mean, I cannot echo enough. Read the book. You must read the book. You can't do it without reading the book. It's just, and luckily, like Robert, I'm a person who loves reading. I love getting paid to read. Mm-hmm. But I also try to make sure that there's space between when I read the book for prep and when I read the book to narrate it, because I want to have just a little bit of space to kind of process the story and marinate on it and not just feel so close to my research of it. So that's another thing I do.
And I'm one of those apocryphal tales. I was doing a series of 20 books for Audible. And, always read the book in advance. And then by the book, like 17, I was falling behind on prepping. And I thought, you know what? I know these characters now. I know what's going on. I think I can do this one cold. I think I can do that. And then I'll start prepping the next book. And read it. And beautifully, the author sets in this character in chapter 3, that by chapter maybe 10 or 11, you had the phrase, in his light German accent.
Oh, that's the nightmare.
And so thank God, we were using a tablet and I could do a search in iAnnotate We had to find every time that character appeared and redo all of his dialogue. But I thought, at the time I was in a fury going, why would you not share that with your readers, or your listeners? Why would you not tell them he is a German? That's a flavor you want to add. But of course, he's doing it for effect. He's trying to hide who the character was and all that. And I thought, oh, never again. And so I learned the hard way, read the book.
Well, that's so funny. Okay, now you said that this year you're recording in your bathroom, like, let's get with the echo out or whatever. January, did you do anything different this year to record, or were you in studio or what?
No, I also have never had a home studio, and I was very fortunate in that I had a friend who was an engineer here in Atlanta in a solo studio, and he basically opened up that studio just to me. And we had our PPE and we had everything else. And we, we didn't speak. We ate lunch in separate rooms. He was the only one allowed to touch the doorknobs for, 6 months. But I continued to record, and I felt very lucky because I live alone, and like going into the studio during the pandemic was like my only other contact with a human being through glass in a soundproof room. But I was really, really lucky to be able to do that. Yeah.
That's great. How about Imogen? How about you? Where were you?
Well, I was already recording from home some of the time, but with an Isovox, which is this kind of, so instead of soundproofing the room, you kind of soundproof your head. It looks like something from Star Trek, but that was not going to be enough with the kids home from school. So I paid a carpenter to build a room in the back of my garage and soundproof that. So I basically made a booth in our garage that we don't use for a car. And now I have my own little studio out in the garage, and it's fabulous. I love it.
Do you see yourself going back to the studio, or do you see yourself staying there?
I mean, it'd be nice to go back, but I don't think I'll go back as much. I mean, I'm doing a drama for 2 days next week, a Doctor Who episode, and we're all in our separate studios, dialing in, listening in on clean feed and acting away to ourselves, but hearing each other. It's just incredible. I think it will change things. Not necessarily, I'm sure some people will just want to go back in the studio, but people like me who live kind of away from the city a bit, it's nice to have that flexibility, especially with kids.
Now, what's the role of a director? Okay, we talked about, what a producer does, but there's a director that's actually directing the whole project, correct? Like they're listening to you, they're telling you that might not be right, you swallowed here. Am I correct or am I wrong?
Not always.
Aha.
Sometimes it's you and an engineer. Sometimes it's you by yourself. I've never done the by myself, but I've quite often had an engineer online or an engineer in the studio and myself. And the engineer will obviously correct you if you've misread or something like that. But that's my experience.
It's actually kind of a controversial topic, Carol, because there was a way that the audiobooks were done when we were making less audiobooks altogether. I mean, as you know, it's like the growth sector of publishing to the nth degree, right? It's suddenly $1 billion industry, and we're making audio of everything, not just the bestsellers, not just the classics. Everything gets an audiobook now, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about the number of people you have to hire to make an audiobook and how much it costs to pay those people, suddenly you're like, do we really need directors? And so there are some publishers that mandate directors, but there are some that don't. And for narrators, the reason I say it's controversial is because it really is asking us to do two jobs at once. You're really asking us to perform and listen at the same time. And any actor will tell you, you're not supposed to watch yourself act, right? Mm-hmm. You're supposed to be completely internal in those characters. Mm-hmm. And so even though it is possible, and many of us have done it, I've done it frequently, I would say in a perfect world, it is not preferable to not have a director. We like having directors. We like being able to be so free in the character that I'm not thinking about whether I just popped that pee, or I can have a dialogue with a director about, what do you think about that moment? Oh, you think I overplayed that? Okay, great. Because I'm not sure, sort of having to do all of so outside eye or outside ear present on your own work can be really challenging and really tiring.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Imogen, do you see the same thing? Or do you like being by yourself?
Interesting. I think I'm on my own here, but I really like being on my own. I'm a real hermit. I think I agree that the result is a lot more mistakes if it's just me. There's going to be a lot more retakes than if I was with a director. But there's something for me about being left completely on my own. I mean, I get so into it. I can just, it's probably not healthy, but in my little booth in my garage, I just work and work and work and work and then go, oh God, I've been at this for 2.5 hours in one session. I need to stop. So it's give and take. It's better and more efficient to have someone listening in, but I do also like that little bubble of just getting completely lost in it and going, oh, okay, I'll do the retakes later.
Speaking of which, how long is your average session? Like, how long can you sit there, and what's the longest, or what's the average kind of time, Robert, that you've ever sat in the studio and said, okay, I'm going to record?
Well, you know, this is a case where I really appreciate an engineer or a director, because I kind of become like a machine. I mean, I become like Imogen does. I get caught up in it, and I will go, you know, we'll start at 10 in the morning and I will go till 12:30 and then go, oh, I probably need a bathroom break or something. But with an engineer or a director, they're like, okay, after an hour, let's take 5 and just, you know, do what we need to do and come back. And as Karen Perlman loves to say, I just need to take a mental health break here. Because it's you know, it's a lot of work listening to an audiobook for mistakes. You're listening to try to make sure it's done correctly, as opposed to just listening for pleasure. And so, yeah, I will keep going and keep going. And it's fortunate that I have people saying, hey, can we stop here? I'm like, oh God, yeah, of course.
Does your voice end up starting to be tired, January? Do you find that, or how long can you go before it's like, you know, break time?
Yeah, I do 7-hour days, and I'm happy to do 2-hour blocks, and that's not every narrator, and everybody's body is different and brain is different. But you know, for me, it's like I get into it and I just want to stay in it. You know, I really want to do as long a swath as I possibly can. In terms of the voice getting tired, it's very much like playing a sport. So if I don't record a book for a couple of weeks, the first day back is hellish. It's very painful. Halfway through the day, it's like I've all this fatigue. But when I'm regularly narrating at least 3-4 days a week, I don't feel it anymore. As long as I warm up properly, get enough sleep, and I'm hydrated enough. Yeah, it's a muscle that develops for me, for sure.
So what's in the studio with you? Water, mouth spray, water, lots of water. How about honey, things like that? Anybody bring nothing like that? No.
I'm straight up black English breakfast tea, PG tips. I love me some PG tips, you know, builder's tea, as they call it. And I just have 2 insulated mugs that last me the whole day. I almost never drink water, which is terrible, but I just find myself just sipping the tea. I love tea, and it's great.
Well, tea is mostly water. Tea is mostly water.
Yeah.
And you're very caffeinated then too, to keep on going.
Right.
Now we understand why you went for 2.5 hours, you know?
Right.
And then the bathroom break.
I've started bringing 2 new things into the booth, actually, which I was quite excited. A solar lamp, and I mean like a sunshine lamp, which is helping keep me awake. Because if you have a kind of black box booth and you're doing these long sessions, you can hit a wall. But having this little kind of UV light, not UV, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like a sunshine lamp helps me stay awake. So that's good. And also a little humidifier. That's a recent addition. And I'm finding it's really helpful to help keep my throat moist. So Robert, you need that if you're not drinking water.
Do you find the humidifier making noise at all, or is it?
No,
quiet
I
enough?
don't have it while I'm reading. I will have it on for an hour before I go in, and then over lunch and in the breaks.
It's good thinking.
So how long would it take? Okay, let's go to one by one, because it's a book I know, the Ruth Ware book. About how long did it take to record that audiobook? A week, 2 weeks?
No, about 3 days, 3.5 days. I mean, obviously prepping it would take about the same amount of time. So I must have scheduled out, I don't know, 2-3 days to prep it, a good 3 days. And then it took, I think, 3 days to narrate. So yeah, I would say your average book would be about 3 days. But when you get into your big 500-page eroticas,
That was 5 days. 5 days of my life I'll never get back.
no, you will
And
not.
I take it the phrasing there has to be a little elongated as well. You know what I mean? When you're reading the erotica.
Don't say elongated when talking about erotica.
This is funny about that. I did a series of Cressley Cole books, and the very first one I did, Karen Perlman was the producer, and I had done something else, and she said, "Oh, you do a Scottish accent. I have a book that might work for. Will you like to audition for it?" And the scene that I auditioned for was completely non necessarily erotic. It expressed this werewolf's desire for this mate that he could scent up above in the streets, and it motivates him to break free from his chains. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. And the writing is very good. And so I thought, this is great. And I booked it and started reading it to prep it. And I was like calling out to my wife. I'm like, Susan, listen to this. What is this? And I had no idea that it was going to become erotica as well. But I will say, she's a terrific writer, and she tells great stories, and people love it. I think I get more response on Twitter and Facebook from Cressley's books than anyone else's.
Interesting. So, okay, do you have authors that you've been through for the whole series? Like, I know you're doing Ruth Ware. Robert, you've done these Star Trek books and
Star Trek. I've done a lot of Michael Corrida's books, and I've done almost all of David Foster Wallace's books except for Infinite Jest, which disappoints me greatly. I would have loved to have been able to do that, but I'm just about to start recording one that I haven't recorded of David Foster Wallace's, which I'm not sure if I can talk about, so that's all I'll say.
It's a little bit of secret. Everybody heard a little bit of secret under the cone of silence.
Yeah.
January, how about you? Is there anybody that you're the voice of?
Yeah, I've got a few. Mary Higgins Clark, who recently passed, which was really exciting for me because my grandmother was the hugest Mary Higgins Clark fan. James Patterson's Women's Murder Club series. I've been doing Nora Roberts for about 5 or 6 years, her standalones. Karen Kingsbury. Yeah, I mean, it's really nice because you sort of get to know a writer's style. You get to know the characters. The prep time gets shorter, which means you're actually making a little more money doing the book because that's how it works. We get paid. I don't know that people know this, so this might be interesting. We get paid by the finished hour. We don't get paid by the amount of time we spend. So, when you take a book, they do the word count. And if it's going to be an 11.36 hour book, roughly, then you know how much money you are going to make doing that book, irrespective of how much time you spend prepping it, how many accents you have to practice, how many medical terms you have to look up for this particular medical drama, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it does make a difference in a narrator's life and career in terms of having some familiarity with, characters and the vernacular of the book. It can be a really nice thing to have that. And my favorite series probably of all time I ever did was Libba Bray's Diviners series. And Libba and I have become really, really close friends through that. So that was awesome.
I never knew it was based by the hour, how long the end recording was going to be. And do you know how long the recording is going to be? Do they know up front, this should be an 11-hour book or this should be a 9, or?
It really goes by word count.
Word count.
I mean, we all vary, a tiny bit here and there, but it's approximately, I think what is it guys, 9,200 words per hour or something like that. So that's how they do the math of it.
I had no idea. I had no idea that that's where see, every audience, I'm hoping you're learning this as well, because this is completely new to me. So, okay. So you sometimes want a really long book. You want it because if you're going to be doing this, it's like, okay, I don't want a 126 page book. I want something that if I'm going to really get myself immersed in it, this is what I want to do. Well, Imogen, at the same time, you write as well as narrate. What is it like narrating your own work?
Oh my God. You would think that while I was writing it, I would have thought about having to narrate it, but no. I wrote it from the first person point of view of about 8 different people. And I put words in, like I had to actually stop myself and say, am I insane? There was one phrase that I wrote in that was, the bathroom had incongruous linoleum. Like, what was I thinking? So the answer is no. When I've got my writer's hat on, I'm just writing. I wasn't thinking about it. It was foolish. So yeah, it's hard. I have to say, it's hard narrating your own work, because this part of your head doesn't want to switch off going, why did you put that word there? What made you think that was a good idea?
Is there ever a moment of like, wait, I can change that word. No one will know. I can change that word right now. It'll be smoother here.
I was so tempted, but I was also just too scared that all of the, because it's been through a copy edit and a kind of story edit, and you think, I can't do it. We all came to an agreement between us that this was the best shape of the story, and I can't. So no, I didn't allow myself to. But I do know that some authors who read their own books, like Mark Billingham, I was at the Cheltenham Literary Festival with him. So he used to be an actor and then became a really successful crime writer. So he narrates his own stuff, and he says to his publishers, you will not be getting the final copy until I narrate the audiobook.
Interesting. Very
So
interesting.
then as he's narrating it, he'll go, oh, no, score that out, send it to the publisher. So yeah.
And
sometimes we're like the last line of editing. I mean, as we're narrating a book, it's usually before it's released, and we're able to say, oh, either there's a misspelling here, or you used the wrong word here. You meant this instead of whatever, and we send that note along to the publisher, the editors, and they can make changes on that. It's always surprising how often you see either typos or just a misspelled name place in a book, and you're like, it doesn't matter in audio, but in the print version, they're going to look at that and go, that's not exactly how that town is spelled. It's interesting.
I narrated a self-help book once where she was referring to E.M. Forster's novel, Howard's Way, which is a 1980s soap opera. And I said, we've got to tell them, this is so embarrassing for her.
Yeah.
We changed it and said to the publishers, it's not Howard's Way, it's Howard's End.
Yeah. This is what you need to do. Well, I've been talking to a lot of authors, and I've said to them, have you taken to reading your books aloud? And a lot of them are now doing this because they're hearing they repeat a word, and they said, you don't know you've repeated that word until you've read the book aloud to yourself and said, that's pretty pitiful, because I've now used that word like 20 times. And I thought it was so clever the first time. So I think that there's more of an awareness of the audio portion of the publication process than people were before. It used to be, I used to joke with authors that audio was like their rights to Finland, like their Finnish rights, because it didn't really matter. You weren't going to make that much money. And now it's a huge part of your revenue. So you want to make sure that the book sounds terrific as well, because so many of your readers are going to be listening, not reading the printed page. Yeah. Something completely different. So there were moments that you wanted to edit as you read. January, what's it like being part of an ensemble cast where you are Charlotte and you are with Meryl Streep? Tell us about that moment.
Oh, if only I were with Meryl Streep. I was in the same studio that she was in at a different time. And it was, it's a very big cast. And we all recorded separately, but at the LA studios for Penguin Random House. Charlotte's web experience is sort of separate from all other things, because that's been in my life. I don't remember a time in my life before Charlotte's Web was in my life. And trying to get Debbie Reynolds' voice out of my head from the cartoon, which beloved in my house growing up. But all I can say is that it was an honor. It was an absolute honor. And I would say, particularly as a woman of color, and knowing that the cast that Kelly Gilday and PRH put together for that was incredibly diverse, and that if the children who were listening to this program were to look us up, I'm Charlotte, and that's right, and that's good, and that's something for, there's a lot about audiobooks that touches inclusivity, access, diversity. That's a whole other panel, but it just felt like a tremendous honor to be able to lift up that story. And be a part of that. So I loved it.
I remember when that was announced, I was at a library or press event, and I heard about it, and I was like, whoa. And what's really interesting is we're taking older material and re-recording, doing, cast ensembles, doing all these kinds of things that, as we're saying, now everything needs to be on audio because people are assuming it will be. They're just assuming that that's what's going to happen. And it needs to be simultaneously released with the hardcover. It can't be, the audio used to come, months later, a year later, or whatever. Now it needs to be the simul rollout. We also build websites for authors, and one of our big bailiwicks is the link does not go up on Apple Books until the day of publication, the audio link. So we always have to go in and do that one. So anybody who's ever looking for an audio, it's not like you can go in and pre-order, it's the day of, and then we have to go in and do that. So there are little quirks that you see along the way with the whole process of this, because it's not just one thing happens. Different publishers do it different ways, different audiobook publishers that are completely different from the physical book publishers do it different ways. And you just have to sit there and say, you know, what's the way of doing it this time? So Robert, am I correct on that, that not everything's the same?
Oh, absolutely. No, you know, it is such a unique thing to think that you have a simultaneous release now, because it did not always do that. And I've participated in some projects of books that had been released a while back that were either being re-recorded or recorded for the first time. So you get this variance in there. But there's something exciting about, you know, I mean, when I was narrating Bob Woodward's books, you know, this was months before they were released, and you sign a non-disclosure agreement, and you're reading all of this stuff that's very upsetting if you're on one end of the spectrum, and yet I couldn't talk to anyone about this. And so I'd be coming home, my wife's going, you're so upset. I'm like, you have no idea what I just read today, and you'll see, you know, it's crazy. So yeah, it gets that, but it's exciting to work on projects that no one has read yet, and to know that it's going to come out at the same time and do all that. I like that does that. I like that we're now doing them simultaneously, but I do appreciate the pressure that puts on almost every publisher to have something, especially a major book, to have an audiobook to accompany that at the time of opening. I did run into one problem once where I was doing a very scientific book, a nonfiction book about a new discovery that called The Link, and it was about something that they considered maybe one of the missing links, and the scientist had named it after his daughter, who spelled her name Ida, and in America we say Ida. And on day one, I said to the producer, you know, hey, is this Ida? Are we saying? They go, yes, we've talked, we're going to do Ida. And on the day it was released, I had just finished doing pickups, and they released it on the same day that it was released, because it was just right to the wire. And on the day it was released, they had a big press conference, and the professor came out and said, yes, I have named it for my daughter Ida. And I went, oh God, no. And I was newer to it. So I called up, the producer said, oh my God, we have to go do pickups. They go, Robert, it's done, it's out. It's out. You know, they said it was okay to Americanize it. I'm like, but it's someone's name. It's not like, is this the British pronunciation of that word or the American? It's the name of the guy's daughter. It's Ida. And so it was only done in the book maybe 1 million times. So, you know, and of course,
you heard it, you're like, no.
Yeah.
No.
No one says, gosh, the producer on that book did a bad job coming up with the pronunciation of that name. Everyone's like, what's wrong with this narrator? How does he not know? You're like, oh. So sometimes releasing on the same day can be a little trouble.
Well, and also we do audio clips at the end of our podcast. So when we talk about the audiobook on the podcast and the video series that we do, because we think it's a very important part of the whole publication process at this time. And a lot of times you can't get the clip. Somebody's writing that in the quotes that you can't even listen to the quote, listen to the audio into the laydown day. Sometimes you can hear just something very oblique or whatever's going on. My personal bailiwick, you all have names that are easy to pronounce. A lot of the audiobook narrators do not. And I'm on this bag of narrators to have phonetic pronunciation of their names on their websites, because you don't know how some people pronounce their names.
You'll hear no arguments from us, because we wish everyone in the world had their own website where they say their name, because we are constantly, if you're doing a book about something that happened in the 1960s, pre-internet, you know, pre-clips of everything, and these may be very famous people. I mean, I did a book about Watergate once that had everybody who testified in the trial. And many of these people have passed away. Many of them, there's no live contemporaneous footage of them saying their own name, or a newscaster said it, but they said it wrong because nobody checked on that stuff. And so, I mean, we're with you. We're with you.
I went to the audio publication, audio publishers Association. I said to them, look, could you just have on a page, everybody just says their name, or we get the phonetic spelling of it. And it, not just with a little accent, because I don't sometimes know what those are. Like, just say it exactly the way it's going to be. And I said, because it's very difficult, because you want to give credit to the person, but it's all of a sudden, wait, that's how you say that name? And a lot of times I'm reaching out and they're like, oh, you can hear it at the beginning of the audiobook. And I'm like, but I don't have the audiobook. I'm just trying to get this little snippet correctly. So there's my little, bailiwick.
There is
here.
a page out there, and I've lost it, that someone was compiling authors saying their names. And I had it like a year ago, and I have not been able to find it since this project. It's
Robert,
not
you
every
must
author in
find
the
it.
world.
You must find it.
I must be just like
Star Trek.
To us.
yes.
You
But
must.
Forvo is our friend.
Forvo,
And I wish there was some way I could expurgate how to pronounce wiki. I wish I could remove it from the internet, because there are a series of pronunciation websites that are just a computer generated voice reading words. That is not helpful at all, because it's the computer just trying to decide what it is. But forvo.com is a great place where people will literally say it from their home country. They'll say the name or the word, and it helps. But that's become the joke I have, is I don't care what a word means, just how do I say it?
That's exactly
So true.
Just let me know how to pronounce your name. I was interviewing Sally Hepworth this week, and she said Barry Krynick, who's her narrator, is not Australian, but she's perfected Australian accents. So she does everything with Australian now. So are any of you known for a certain voice, a certain whatever? I know, Imogen, you're the voice of Ruth Ware. Like, you're the, I can see, it's like, whenever I listen to one of her books, I'm like, oh yes, I now know who is doing that. So are any of you known as the voice of?
Well, I like the Cressley Cole series, for her paranormal romance, the Immortals After Dark series. I was the voice of, and that's nice. And I think that Scottish accent helped, and being able to do it. There were about 4 more books with Scottish characters in it. So, and I think that was the one that I got the most response from. My wife at one time had compiled a list of I don't read reviews ever.
Okay.
As an actor on stage, I learned years ago not to. And as an audiobook narrator, it just, why put that person in your head, good or bad? Because good, it's never going to be good enough, and bad, it's just going to make you think bad things. But she went through and was looking at stuff, and she compiled a little list of things that people were writing about the Cressley Cole books, and finished it with, I think I'm going to have to get you a bodyguard. So it sometimes the fan response can be very fun.
Fun to sit there and hear what they say. Well, I'm going to go to some questions from the audience. If you've got to go back and forth with different accents, Imogen, and with Ruth Ware's books, where the characters from different parts of England have different accents, how do you do that smoothly? And how do you remember which character has which accent?
Okay, so the which character has which accent is why I highlight the characters in a particular color, so that at speed I can go, okay, in this context, yellow means this and red means this. I think the ability to talk to yourself in One by One, there are group scenes of people from all over the world. There's American, there's a kind of Indian upper class Brit, there's a slightly Danish person. The ability to talk to yourself in all of those different accents seamlessly, making as few mistakes as possible. I just put it down to just kind of latent mental health issues.
What's going on?
A base level of insanity that you need to be able to talk to yourself like that. It's hard, but but as January was saying, it's a muscle. So the more you do it, the more used to it you become.
There are people now sitting outside your garage saying she's completely deranged. She's now speaking in tongues. You do know that now.
Neighbors, and I think even the best soundproofing in the world probably can't cover some of the racket I make, and they must think I'm absolutely insane.
Yeah.
It's a really common question that is asked of narrators about how do you keep it straight in your mind. Mm-hmm. And I understand why it's a common question, but the reality is when you're narrating, at least for me, I don't think of it that way. I'm not approaching them as like, who is this? The reason you read the book, and hopefully if it's well written and the characters are well drawn, is because you get to know them as people and characters. So it's not a like, I understand why it seems like maybe a spreadsheet mentality of like, let me check how this person sounds. But really it's like, they're people that I meet and then I re-encounter those people. And so that's how, in terms of keeping it straight, does that wash with either of you in terms of your
Oh, I like
process?
that.
Yeah,
I like that
that's
a lot.
I'm
But I'm like
perfect.
Imogen, where I highlight all the characters just so the switch back and forth, because sometimes the attribution comes later in the paragraph or whatever. And if there are multiple people talking, it really does help me to keep the flow going, and I can switch really quickly back and forth. But I totally get what you're saying, January. You get to know them. It's what's surprising is how easily the voice comes back. 4 chapters later, you're doing it again, and you come right in with the voice because you know that character. Now, 2 days later, if the character hasn't come in, I'll say, to the producer, do you have a sample of what I did on day one? Especially with a smaller character who's not in the book a lot and appears here and there, and you listen again, oh, it was a high-pitched kind of nasally American sound. Okay, great, we'll do that. But for the most part, your main characters, and my great joy, I was a Star Trek nerd growing up, and the original series was my series. And so getting to voice Kirk and Spock and McCoy, I know those voices, I have them in my head. And so, getting to do William Shatner, you don't want to do too much, but you do a little. And so it's fun to do that, and fun to discover, where do I play Spock in my voice. The one that evades me, to my great shame, is Uhura. I can't quite get her voice the way I want her to. So every time I have an Uhura thing, I'm just devastated that I'm not giving Nichelle Nichols the right thing, the right treatment.
The right treatment. Here's another question for you, Robert. I love the questioner saying, I love your narration of Cressley Cole's Immortals After Dark series. Do you have a favorite book or character in the series to narrate?
I think in the first book, A Hunger Like No Other, I think it was, oh God, no, of course, I'm going to forget his name and they're all going to kill me. The main character in that book, Lachlan, is it Lachlan? Thank you, Jacqueline. Lachlan, I just love he had that Scottish voice, and he was talking like this, and it's a very masculine, very thing. And I find, I was doing just different Scottish people I'd listen to. I would, sometimes the voice is up here, it's sort of like Billy, Billy Connolly, and sort of there, and doing that. But I loved, and the Scottish is just fun. It's just beautiful. I love accents, dialects so much. I toured in England in a play once, and you learn that accents change after every street block. On every corner, you as a young actor, you're like, oh, I do a British accent, and you're like, yes, which one? Because there's a billion of them, and I fall in love with people sometimes just based on the way they sound. I'll be at a party and someone will be speaking, and I'll just be like, oh God, I don't care what you're talking about. I just love listening to the way you put words out into the air. I think Americans in general are quite enamored of British accents, but for me, it's the whole spectrum, and it also, it becomes a little touchy. You want to go very light with accents, but if I am doing an African American character, I want to make sure that I'm not doing some horrible stereotype version of that. I want to do always you want to do a human being, and so I tread very lightly. And there was a book, a first person narration of a slave in pre-Civil War that was using the phrase massa and stuff like that, written that way. And I immediately called the producer and said, this is not my book. We need to find a different narrator for this, because it will be, I think, incredibly offensive if a white narrator is doing an entire first person slave. And she right away said, oh my God, I missed that completely. It was a short story in a series of short stories. And so she immediately got a fabulous, Dion Graham to do it. And we were saved. But I'm a lot more aware of that now than I was when I first began narrating.
And being authentic, making sure everything's authentic.
Yeah.
Someone has a question for the multiple, I think it's for you, January, for the multiple cast audiobook. How does the computation of pay work? If it's usually by the hour, now is it by the minutes that you were doing that? And as a result of the cast members paid by the whole body of computation? And she says, sorry for the nerdy question.
No, I love nerdy questions.
It's a very good question.
I love nerdy questions. I'm a teacher. Yes. So generally what they do is that they will compute it by minutes if it's less than that. I mean, there are lots of multicast books where, like, I just did one with Dan Bittner where, like, I had 10 hours and he had 2 hours, so it can be more than an hour. But for multicast programs like a Charlotte's Web, what the producers will usually do is guarantee you an hour. Like, whatever your rate is, they'll guarantee you 1 hour of that. So that you're being compensated for how, if yours is 17 minutes or 47 minutes, you're still going to get your hour. That's generally how it's done.
Very interesting. Has anyone ever turned down a project because you didn't agree with the perspective of the book politically and or morally?
Oh, yes.
I wish. I
Oh,
wish.
yes.
There have been things that, because essentially they're asking you for a yes before you've actually read it. I mean, you do not have time to read the entire book, take a week and come back to them. They want to know if it's a yes. So you read the blurb and you can do what you can do with that. There have been things that I've taken on where I should have been given a trigger warning and I wasn't. And just because of things going on in my life at that time, I thought, you know what? I have plenty of work. If I'd known this was coming, I would have said no. So I think the issue around trigger warnings is, I don't know, I try and bring it up with people and people have different opinions on it. But I just think if you're signing on to emotionally invest in the telling of a story and it deals with stuff that's going to be incredibly painful for you, that you should at least have a heads up on that. Because there might be some years where that feels copable with, and other years where you think this isn't worth my time and my money.
Anyone else on that? Anyone else on turning
Yeah, I
things
mean,
down?
I do a lot of political books, and there's definitely a spectrum of political books I won't do. I don't want to contribute to that narrative out in the world. And it's a tight line to walk, but you, like I said, I feel my responsibility as a storyteller is to tell stories that I think help the world, or are literature in some way, or informative or interesting, and if it's something that I think contributes or doesn't contribute to the betterment of the country or the narrative in the world, then I feel like I'm not your narrator. And respectfully, I mean, listen, everyone has their opinion. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. I just feel like some opinions cause damage more than others, and I don't want to participate in that.
And there's a certain amount of privilege as your career expands as a narrator that you get to say no. I narrated things at the beginning of my career when people, I'm not going to say it because people Google it, but people Google it and they're like, "You did what?" And I was like, I was getting married. I was so broke. And I called my mother and I said, "Mom, I got asked to do this book and they're going to pay me all this money that's going to make my life easier." And she was like, "Sweetheart, I think you just think about a tithe. Just donate 10% of the money that you make on that book to an organization that person would hate. And I think we can just get through this." And that's exactly what I did. But I was young and I needed the money. It's not just a cliche with performers.
Yeah.
And now I have the luxury and the privilege of absolutely saying, "No, I won't do that. I don't care to get involved in that, et cetera, et cetera." But as a young artist in a very expensive city trying to make your way, yeah, it's really complicated. It's really hard.
And you're right, because sometimes you don't know the whole book up front. You don't know where it's going to go on page 120 or 130, and even if it's a rape scene, if it's something like this that you're just not comfortable of talking about, it doesn't even have to be political, something else that happens during the story that you're just saying, I don't think I want to be doing this.
And also, I think, sorry, just with referring to that, because that's kind of what I was talking about with trigger warnings, is I also find if I'm dealing with something that I think is going to be triggering for a lot of people, I also try and do a bit of research into the author and their reasons for writing it. There have been some things that I've dealt with that have dealt with paedophilia. Anyway, I've done research into the author, and if they have done their research and they're trying to kind of deal with the issue, and if they've interviewed people and they're actually trying to, as Robert says, put a useful narrative out there, then I think, well, then, I've got to put up with it because I want to be part of a story that's going to help. But I think context is key.
So do you all listen to audiobooks Like, is that how do you read? Do you listen to audio? What do you usually do? January, you're shaking your head.
I'm so visual. I think it's part of what makes me a good narrator is that's how I like to consume books. But I will say, I love listening to memoirs narrated by the
Ew.
author. I
Me too.
love like Trevor Noah is to me, Born a Crime is one of the greatest audiobooks ever produced. There are so many, but that I love.
And I step in with Michelle Obama.
Yes,
I'm listening to it
yes.
on my dog walk. I
Yeah.
cry every day, every chapter. I'm walking my
yes.
dog sobbing, and people are like, "What? You don't understand."
Yeah.
So
And,
yeah.
I think that you've touched on something that this is why people, more and more authors want to narrate, and why people want more and more authors to narrate, especially memoirs, but other things as well. People are excited to hear that the person who wrote it is narrating it. I don't like that as much because it takes away from my ability to narrate their books. But certainly with memoirs, I mean, I remember it may have been the very first audiobook I ever listened to was a David Sedaris book. And no one on the planet could ever narrate David Sedaris's work like David Sedaris. Matter of fact, my wife and I, early on in the relationship, we would take turns reading books to each other in bed. And we had a David Sedaris book that was given to us. And, when I started doing it, I started trying to do David Sedaris. If I would read the book, I would talk like David, because that was the only way you can do a David Sedaris book out loud. So yes, I love hearing someone like that, especially narrate their own book.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Memoir, I actually can remember scenes in like Candace Bergen's book. I can remember scenes in so many of these books because of the way they're just telling their story. And it's so empowering. And it's even the bad times of what's going on. There's just something about the way that they do this that I think is really super special. Anything else you'd like to share? We're coming up on the last couple of minutes. Go ahead.
I just want to say, I just want to say quickly that to Robert's point about the more authors who narrate, the worse it is for us. I think we're very fortunate in the fact that actually audiobook narration is a very specific skill set. And there aren't that many people in the world who do it super well. It's like a mouth, eye, mind connection. Like your biology doesn't make a lot of mouth noises, but there's all kinds of things that you can't really control. And so, I welcome the authors to come and narrate as much as they want, because I've gotten many a phone call like, we had the author in the studio, it's not working out, can you be here tomorrow? So I think it's fine.
You hear from engineers or producers saying, well, I had an author yesterday, and almost invariably I keep hearing the author going, this is really hard. I thought this would just be so easy, and it is. It's quite a challenge to do.
Same with celebritas who are booked for books and turn up, probably haven't read it. Some of them are brilliant, but some of them I've heard similar stories.
Oh yeah, stories of people walking out of sessions after an hour and saying, no, I'm not doing this.
Yes.
And then they have to, scramble and
then we get the call.
We get the call.
You've also alluded to like sounds that your voice makes. There are things like, I talk too fast and I trail off on some words. Like I don't completely enunciate the word. What are some things besides stomach sounds that happen when you're in the studio? Swallowing,
Mouth noise.
Mouth
like
noise.
Mouth noise.
Inhaling.
Any of us can have a bad stomach day, and there's nothing you can do. There's nothing you can do.
I keep joking about, I want to create like a vest that you put on that has nothing but acoustical foam around it, because I spend most sessions after lunch with a pillow in front of my stomach. It doesn't completely eliminate it, but it helps mute some of the smaller stuff. But I have, it's something I never knew about myself until I narrated audiobooks. I have a very noisy stomach. And it's all because I have a giant sweet tooth, and I find for me sugar, blah, 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 blah.
Sugar will be doing it too. It's so interesting because I just know that people go in and they say, I have my mouth spray. I have this, that, the other thing of what I'm going to do, because you could get dry mouth just doing this. And if you have a dry mouth, you are not going to say words the same way. It's just not going to come out the same way as well. So we're coming right up on time. I want to thank all three of you for joining us. This was just absolutely fabulous. You answered so many of my questions, and I think I got to all the audience questions that we were able to do. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Yes, thank you all so much. We really appreciate you being here at the Newburyport Literary Festival. And I hope participants, you will come back and check out some of our other events because there's a great schedule ahead of us.